No nonsense, know-how here, and this evening I'd like to bring you a fast-paced overview on how to replace the timing belt and water pump in this 2010 Subaru Legacy with a 2.5 liter. It's supposed to go well below freezing into the teens tonight, so I'm going to try to rush through this one, but I'll make sure to keep all the details that are important to you. If I miss anything, make sure that you always check that description down below for any updates and any tools or parts I use in this video too. So to get started, you go ahead and remove your negative terminal from the battery, 10mm on that. And then get your vehicle jacked up, so put the parking brake on, chock the rear wheels, and then I jacked it up on the front here. He's actually got a skid plate on this thing, but you have a good jacking point up on the front, and then put your jack stands down. I'm not going to show you exactly how to jack a vehicle. This is kind of for your intermediate level DIYer. Then, provided your engine's cool, come down below, and with a Phillips, looks like it was a number 3 Phillips, you have a drain screw on the bottom of your radiator, so you can put a piece of paper there and get that drain in. Then come up top and remove the cap to break the vacuum and get that flowing good. Now remove these 4 plastic fasteners simply by doing do a quarter turn on it and then pull up and pull that right out of there. I'm going to tuck this upper radiator hose out of my way too, get some extra room. If you loosen this clamp too, you can just twist the whole thing over, or heck, just remove it in its entirety. Next step is removing the 22mm crankshaft pulley bolt. These can be kind of stubborn. Several techniques to do this. This one's a manual transmission, so I'm going to try putting it in gear and then just cranking that off. But you can use a starter motor technique, or also wrap an old belt around this and then the alternator I've seen people do. If you Google it though, there's several techniques. Ideally you want all 4 wheels on the ground with the parking brake on, but I just wedged a brake depressor in there. We'll see if that works. There we go, not bad at all. Good old manual transmission. Notate your belt routing and then use a 15mm socket to turn this clockwise and pull the belt off. You can remove your crank bolt now, and if you're lucky, the damper will wiggle off. You can see this one's coming off. Sometimes they get seized on there though. If you do have that happen though, sometimes if you just shoot rust penetrant in here and tap it with a hammer a couple times, it'll loosen it up. Get these iron brackets off by removing these 3 14mm head bolts, and then that slides right off. Pop off the driver's side timing belt cover, which has 3 10mm bolts holding it on. You can disconnect your O2 sensors. I'm going to try leaving mine. I did pop them out of this lower connector though, and now remove the main timing cover, which is held on by 11 bolts, 10mm head. One of them was standard like this, and the rest were these shouldered bolts. You can see how rusted and tough they were to get off though. One of them did end up breaking, unfortunately, and I did have to use a easy off right here to get a couple of them. Now you're gonna reinstall the crank bolt and remove the 2 10mm bolts from this timing belt guide, and rotate it clockwise until this notch lines up with this notch, and then come over to each of your camshafts, and you should have this notch at the 12 o'clock position. If it's not, rotate the crank another 180 degrees. But this one lines up with the notch on that cover, and then over on the passenger side, you have a white line that lines up with that line right there. This side doesn't have a notch put in it, it just lines up with the casting. The engine is timed. Now remove the 14mm bolts from these pulleys. You got 1, 2, 3. Set those in an orientation that you'll remember where they go, or better yet, replace one at a time if you want. And now you can see our belt's ready to just pop off there, and you can remove the tensioner 14mm. It's important not to remove this one if this is under any tension, because it can rip the last thread out of the aluminum block. You can see there's a washer on the front, and there should generally be one on the back too. There it is. It's held on with that little O-ring, so make sure those parts come out. You could see this hydraulic tensioner was leaking pretty good in there. Here's a look at our Gates kit we're going to be using. Again, I'll try and plug links to it. This belt is made in USA, which is pretty sweet. It's got a steel gasket, which I like. And here's the water pump. So if you're not replacing the pump, you can skip ahead. I'll put timestamps down below. But if you are, then looks like it's got 6 10mm head bolts holding it on. And then you have this one hose here too. And of course the 2 10mm bolts on your thermostat housing. So that back hose is a little tight to get to, but let me get those off and I'll chime back with you. And make sure to put your pan down there, because there may be some coolant inside of the block. With the thermostat housing off, you'll want to clean up any corrosion on that surface, and then that gives you plenty of room to pull this lower hose off. And with that spring clamp, take that off and pop your thermostat out. Now, when you put this in, this little dongle is going to go up, the little jiggly valve. That's to allow air to bleed out. And you should replace this thermostat. I'm not replacing this one, but I'm going to be replacing the gasket at least. It isn't easy to replace thermostat though, so it's not a big deal. And not too much coolant really came out of there either. And with those 6 bolts out, give her a little pry or taparoo. And that's the water pump out. A little more coolant came out too. With the belly pan, it gets real messy sometimes, but I have this big extension, which really helps out. Come in and remove your old gasket, and then use a little emery cloth or something to touch that up, especially if there's any corrosion like you see on the bottom here. Get that all cleaned up. I went real light on it with this 3M bristle disc and just touched it up. I also soaked up the coolant in the bottom of it and cleaned it with acetone. Now you can bolt the new pump in. I like to take the new gasket and rub a very thin layer on both sides of RTV. I like Permatex the right stuff. Not globs of it, just enough so there's a tiny little smear on it. And go ahead and install that. The RTV also helps hold the gasket so it doesn't slip off the pump when you're putting it on. Make sure your pump spins freely. Install your new thermostat O-ring, the slit in it, the groove. Make sure it's seated all the way around. This one's a touch loose. And then I like to actually take grease of any sort and rub some grease on that to try to prevent corrosion in the future. Remember, jiggle valve at 12 o'clock, put it in, and bolt your housing on. I'm now going to install the 3 idler pulleys in their appropriate locations, and the kit did come with some thread locker, so I'm going to put some of that on each of the bolts. Those 14 mil bolts get torqued down to 29 foot-pounds. Looks good, and make sure they all spin freely. They specify they want you to bleed the tensioner before installing it in case of any air that got in there during shipping or shipping and handling. So you can put a C-clamp inside of a vise and then put some pressure on it, pull your pin out, and now you are going to relieve the pressure, let the plunger come out completely, and then slowly push it back in with the C-clamp, making sure not to force it. Just use light tension. You basically got to go slow with it. And once you do that 3 times, you can reinsert your pin. Make sure you insert it from this side where the bolt is, and don't push it through any further than it has to go. Just make sure it does go into both of the holes. You do have to make sure it's in the 12 o'clock position when you do this. A small C-clamp works, however, using a larger one like this would be much better. I did do that 3 times though, and it's ready to put in. Dab of blue Loctite. Same thing, 29 foot-pounds. It should rock back and forth, and this pin should contact the steel pin inside the block. Go ahead and slip the new belt on the pulleys in this orientation so that the arrows are facing that way. And you see you have the white marks that line up on the notches. One over here for the side. So let me get that on, I'll show you. These are tight belts to get on. I started by lining this notch up with the crank pulley. Okay, and come over here, line this notch up with your notch there and wrap it around. And same thing over on the passenger side. And then I actually removed this idler pulley down here to give a little bit more room, and still it was really tight, so I loosened this one so that I could rock this pulley a little bit, and then you can see I was able to slip that on just barely. So now with the belt on, I can tighten this back down and reinstall the other idler pulley. Looks good. You just got to make sure you don't cross thread that bolt when you're lining that idler pulley back up, and now we can slide the pin out. It's almost like you didn't even need a tensioner on this darn thing. Now rotate the engine 2 turns clockwise with this crank, and we're going to recheck our timing marks. Don't worry about the markings on the belt. Just check your timing marks on the cam to case, crank, and over here. Looks good. All that talking, and I forgot to put my coolant bypass hose on. Make sure to slip that on the water pump nipple, and if the clamp's not super rusted, you can reuse it. Otherwise, replace it with a worm gear clamp. Take your crank bolt back out by giving it a little jerk. Should come out like that. Reinstall the timing belt guide, and they do give you this plastic piece to use as a spacer. Then pull that out once you tighten the bolts down. That's a tight fit in there. Oh. Reinstall your lower timing cover, but make sure to check the gasket first and that it's not swelling or bulging out. If it's oil soaked or it's not in there firm, just get rid of it because it could wrap around the timing belt. I did just wipe this out with a cloth. I wouldn't get crazy with it. It doesn't need to be spotless. Unfortunately, I'll have to reuse these terribly rusted bolts. I did shoot a bunch of lube all over them though. Resecure your O2 sensor wires and then install the driver's side timing cover. Dab a blue Loctite on the crank pulley bolt and reinstall that, making sure to line the key up with the keyway and that it fully seats. And then go ahead and torque this down to 133 foot-pounds. Since I'm putting a new belt on this, I decided to use the belt trick for torquing this instead of put it in gear. So I'll take this off and show you, but essentially you wrap it around the alternator, and I used the AC pulley as well since it's a lot longer. And you wrap a pinch of the belt through, and then you can see it kind of coils itself and binds up against the pulley there, which enables you to torque it to that 133 foot-pounds. Very nice. Then we wrap this off so I can hopefully show you the way it goes on. So if you spin this, of course you can use this for getting it off too, but you see, you just set this down here. I mean, you basically wrap it around here and then you fold a pinch of it in here and keep rotating it. Now you can reinstall the iron bracket and reinstall your belt, which should look like that, and then reinstall your upper radiator hose and the plastic covers. Reconnect your battery, make sure the petcock's closed on the radiator, and using one of these Lyle funnel kits is really awesome. That comes with adapters for all different radiators. You can fill this up now and burp all the air out of it. Once it's done gurgling, leave a couple inches in here and go fire her up. Sometimes those Subarus got to crank for a while after you disconnect the battery. Put the blower and heat on high and wedge something between the gas pedal to bring it up to about 2,000 RPM or so. That'll help burp the rest of the air out of the system and burn off all the residual coolant down there. Let that run for about 10 minutes until all the air bubbles are done coming out. You can massage the hose if you'd like, and make sure the radiator fans come on also. Heat's blowing hot. Bring that back down to idle. And remove your spill-free funnel by squeezing the radiator hose in about halfway, dropping a plunger in, let go of the rad hose, pull it off. You shouldn't have any mess, and put your rad cap back on. Make sure to top your coolant reservoir off too. And that'll wrap it up. I didn't even film an outro last night because my hands were like icicles. Hopefully this helped you out. Consider dropping it a thumbs up like I said, or maybe checking out one of my other videos since that helps me out big time. And yeah, any questions, comments, leave them down below. I'll try to plug those links in too. I know it was super rapid fire, ultra pace, but I tried to give you all the hopefully relevant information and keep it as short as possible. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again.